What is it you want, Barry? What do you want? You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, dying times here.
Come with me if you want to live.
That's it, man. Game over, man. Game over.
The Force will be with you, always.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to 20th Century Geek. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and today we're going to be touching on something a little dark and a little light. We're going to be talking about religious iconography in horror films. Now, there's only one person I could think of to call on to do this. He's the sinister minister, the minister of the macabre. He is Peter Laws, author and journalist.
Hello, everyone. Yes, good to be here to talk about this pretty crazy topic. But yeah, it's good to chat to you again, Scott. Good to be
you
here.
too. Thank you for coming on. For those that don't know you, do you want to introduce yourself? And of course, let's get the plug in early as well for anything you want.
Yeah, sure. I mean, people can. Sometimes when they hear that I'm a church minister and I'm talking about horror films, they think that I'm here to kind of swing in and rescue horror fans and get them away from 18 certificate films or something. That is not my aim. I'm basically a person who has loved horror all my life. In fact, I was watching horror movies way before I even considered setting foot in a church. I became a Christian in my early 20s. And so for me, horror has always been a very meaningful genre for me. And so when I became a Christian, I tried to give it up for a while because some Christians told me that it was not a good thing for a Christian to like horror. But actually, I started to realize that I think, the Bible and religion in general is actually quite well connected with the subject of horror, and that those two things can sit together quite well. So yeah, so I write on horror these days, and sometimes where it connects with religion. I'm also an author of not just non-fiction, but also of a fiction series called the Matt Hunter series, where it's about basically a church minister, an ex-church minister turned atheist academic who helps solve the religiously motivated crimes, things like that. And so that's kind of my day job at the moment, writing and writing for the Fortean Times magazine, and also still doing bits of church things here and there.
Excellent. Living the dream. Living the dream. Yeah.
Living the dream. Yeah, it's a pretty weird dream. For some people, it's like, what? Like, they still can't get their heads around the idea that someone who is, would call themselves religious or spiritual would have an interest in the dark side. But I just think that's a very natural part of human personalities, that we are a mixture of the sort of the dark and the light. I think that's where the beauty is, where that combo is. I've met people who are, they act fully light at all times, and I kind of don't trust them.
Yeah, I definitely touched on it. It's funny you say, and having read your book. In fact, I've read two of your books recently, but I haven't read The Frighteners.
Oof, well.
The Frighteners recently.
Yes.
Like you touched on that point that to suppress the darkness and to try and sort of just look on the happy side and sort of go, no, it's all sweetness and light. You're just ignoring a huge part of history and pop culture and society and everything.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. And don't get me wrong, some people do that. I remember being at a dinner party once with a lady, and she said she would never dream of watching the news because she just couldn't handle the kind of the sadness of the world. And I thought, well, I mean, that's just not me. I'm a sort of person who is disturbed by real life murder and the horrible things that happen in the world and torture and suffering. I think it's fairly normal to be disturbed by that, but I also think it's fairly normal to want to explore it and to try and ponder it and try to learn to be brave around it and get my head around these things. I do that through fiction, through horror, stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think horror definitely is a genre that sort of it marries up with so many other bits and pieces that it can easily be explored. It can be a great social commentary. It's the cliche, I suppose, is Night of the Living Dead, and as a commentary on and Dawn of the Dead being commentary on consumerism and all that kind of thing. So
Yeah, and also I found actually because growing up I wasn't a churchgoer or a Christian. In fact, I was really very anti-religious, particularly anti-Christianity. I really had a problem with Christians. I thought they were trying to turn me into something like some sort of geek or some sort of sandal wearing, socks wearing, rainbow strap guitar hanging type hippie type who would not have any, never watch an 18 certificate film and would love everyone completely and never have a crossword and all that sort of thing. And I thought, I can't be that. I can't stop watching scary films. I can't stop being human. And so I actually put off going to church for a long time. Well, I say I put off. I didn't even think about it as being an option. But it was ironically, it was horror films, particularly films like The Exorcist, which I'm sure we'll end up talking about, which started to just make me ask some of the more spiritual questions. So while some people will say to me, you know what, some Christians would say horror is an inappropriate genre to have in society, I'd actually say, no, it's very appropriate. And in fact, it can oddly be a doorway into spiritual thinking. So to me, I think more Christians should embrace and promote horror. In fact, it's one of the only genres that takes the supernatural seriously. I mean, so many people I know, like Christians I know, will kind of say, "Oh no, don't watch that scary stuff. You should just be watching nice things like, I don't know,
Disney,
Evan Almighty, that film that came out. That's biblical." It's like, no, it wasn't. It was using a biblical idea, but it was just a kind of nice, soft, and it was fun. Don't get me wrong, but life and religion is supposed to deal with deep stuff as well as surface stuff. And I think horror does that really well.
I agree. I think it can really challenge, some thinking. And I think there's been several films that have really done that for me recently. I think, they come up, and I think we'll definitely touch on a few, but there's been films in the past couple of years, Hereditary and...
Oh, yeah, I liked Hereditary a lot.
And... recently we'll touch on The Apostle.
Oh yes, on the Netflix.
Yeah,
on the Netflix. Did I say on the Netflix?
The Netflix. This is on the
It's on the Netflix.
That's it. This is on the internet. So I think that's they really can challenge your thinking and your ideas of things, and I think that's almost what these creative outputs should be doing. They're there not just to they can be fluff and they can be entertainment, but they can also challenge your concept of reality.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I need fluff as well. So I will really enjoy watching, like, I don't know, I could watch an old episode of Columbo or The Love Boat or something like really sort of. Well, actually, Columbo's not banal, but The Love Boat certainly is. And I actually find that after I'm writing novels, I'm just working on my fourth one at the moment. At the end of the day, when I've just been writing about, demons and murder and all that sort of stuff, I need something that's purely a palate cleanser. But equally, if I was to live my life pretending that everything is okay when it's just clearly not, that would make me unsettled. Because and it would also mean I would never have an opportunity to engage in the things that scare me. That's how you learn courage, I think, by engagement. So yeah, it makes sense that horror exists, and it's not going to go away. I just know it's not.
No, it's a fundamental part of the human condition, isn't it? So,
yeah.
But what we're going to be talking about here is obviously horror and its relationship with religion and religious iconography. And so, really, just those high-level thoughts, really. We've discussed it around it, but actual in films, what are your initial thoughts then, really, of sort of the horror film and their use of religious iconography?
Well, I'd say that when you start thinking about it, it becomes actually quite shocking how much religion is in horror. And I don't just mean religion in general. Of course, there's many, many different religions, but many of your listeners perhaps will be used to or have more of a kind of Hollywood-centric diet when it comes to the films they watch. And so particularly kind of Western films and Hollywood films have a massive amount of religious ideas in them. And they just keep doing it. And even at a point when society is kind of turning away from religion or organized religion, these days, many people would get the impression that Christianity is pretty much dying out. Ironically, it's actually growing more today than it ever has in history across the world. But certainly in countries like England and America, numbers are going down in terms of people who go to church. So you would think that would go away. But then you get horror movies, well, I mean, the obvious examples are things like The Nun or the Conjuring films, that are just, they're so steeped in Christianity that, number one, it's very interesting, I think, to see that our society is haunted by the religion it leaves behind. I think that's something that does happen, that, for many of us, we feel we don't want to be part of a organized religious worldview, and that's fine. I totally understand that. But many people do remain spiritual, let's say, or they have an interest in the spirituality. And even if they're not, even if they're atheists, they still live in a post-Christendom world. And so these topics are still relevant. And so it's not a surprise to find them in horror films. But actually, you could say that, and I saw an article recently about this, which was saying that horror films are so Christianized at times, it's almost like religious propaganda. They're almost pushing this view that evil is in the world and the only answer is, after all, in organized religion. And for some people in our modern world, that's actually quite offensive, because it's like, well, hang on a minute, we've ditched that. And so horror films, I find it interesting that they still do that. In so many ways, many of us we feel like, say, Christianity, organized Christianity, is not irrelevant to our lives. But ironically, once somebody in your family starts acting in a kind of demonic way, or in films where things start going crazy and, heads are spinning and there's demonic nuns creeping up your steps at night, suddenly the church becomes quite relevant.
Yeah, it's...
And I find that quite interesting.
It is. Nothing that it's almost like the trope, isn't it? Sort of like if you were to watch some of the haunted house or possession movies, very much is almost like there's almost like a step by step guide. There's denial at the beginning, and then there's sort of like fear and acceptance, and then step number 3 is priest, and it's sort of like it's straight into that, and you're like, well, you started out as a non-believer, and then literally within like 3 steps, you are now welcoming. And it's
absolutely, and it's not just, obviously, it's not just priest. Like sometimes, and particularly in the kind of 70s and into the 80s, as kind of Christianity began to lose its sort of currency in popular culture, then that's where you start to see the more scientific religious aspects coming in, which are more like the sort of the psychics, the spiritualists, the paranormal investigators, who would, in some ways, just be doing things like they would be waving around, let's say, and they still do this today, waving around EMF meters or, like motion detectors and stuff. Yes, as a tool to register scientific inquiry, of course, to get data, but they almost wave these things around like they are religious objects, that they are the connection between this world and the next. And in my book, The Frighteners, which explores why people love monsters, ghosts, death, and gore, and why I do, I interviewed a barrister who is also the chairman of the Ghost Club in Britain, and he was saying about how these days modern ghost hunting is very similar to kind of Victorian spiritualism, where people are kind of finding some sort of spiritual experience that has a scientific vibe because they measure stuff and they record stuff. But I suppose the point I'm trying to make is, when stuff happens that's outside of our realm of logic, for example, chairs moving around by themselves in horror films or in real life, and we go to, who are you going to go to for that? Who are you going to call? But, are you going to go to Citizens Advice? Are you going to go to the doctors? So this is, and of course, the great example of this is The Exorcist, where, they go to, they exhaust all of the normal channels. That's what I like about The Exorcist, actually, because the woman does take her child to sensible places like the doctors and to psychologists. And that's what I would say to anyone who's having a supernatural experience. Don't neglect the medical explanation.
Yeah.
But in the end, you're right. They go to the church in the end, and the church ends up being the answer, which is very unusual.
It is. I think. I mean, it's taken on a bit more of a. It comes in waves, and I think it's on a bit of an upswing at the moment with the Conjuring universe, and obviously, as you said, you mentioned the Nun being one of the most recent additions to that franchise. But one of the things I found was sort of like, the more I looked at this, I was sort of sat down and looked at the kinds of films that were being produced and what Hollywood produces, and I sort of found there's like three religion sort of falls into three categories, and I could be miles off, but it was just a thought. Really, was there's and it comes under sort of this thing that you said about being the sort of the go-to is it either becomes the easy get out clause. So we're going against evil, so we use the ultimate light. So we turn to some form of religion, usually sort of a form of Christianity, or they are the dogmatic villain. So they get sort of put in, and as you said about that, people sort of don't want to become or fear being part of that organised society. Is like for horror films where they throw them in as like, well, they're almost like the Empire. You know what I mean? They're sort of like, oh yeah, the Vatican or the bishop or whatever. It's or even like a cult. They are the dogmatic villain of the piece.
No, that's true. Yeah.
And then the other thing really was less sort of a dogmatic thing, but was as the other, like religions we don't understand, like and the one that sort of really sort of jumped to mind was, I don't know if you've seen The Serpent and the Rainbow.
Oh yes, yeah, the Wes Craven film.
So and this sort of that's based on on alleged true events, but it's that idea of voodoo and Haitian culture being the other, and just simply by being another, it becomes it becomes almost like an evil supernatural entity.
Yeah. No, I think that's a pretty clever way of differentiating, and I think that is what happens, and that's what's interesting about other religions that are, when you say other religions as if they're the religions from other countries, but of course, we live in a multicultural society. We can't just say this is a Christian country. That's not I don't think that's a really helpful way of putting it. It's a country filled with lots of different people with faith and no faith. But what's interesting is, yes, horror films can sometimes be, if you could call it quite old-fashioned, in that they cling to Christianity almost being the norm, and then they use this feeling of other religions as being, like you say, the other, as a source of fear. And so The Exorcist is a great example where it starts with the Muslim call to prayer over the title sequence. And I know various people have watched that and just felt creeped out. And they're sitting there going, oh, that sounds scary. That's somebody kind of praying in another language, and I've been programmed to think that that's bad. But of course, you're sitting next to your Muslim friend and he's going, that's just normal. That's just a prayer. That would be like somebody praying the Lord's Prayer, that many people might know, Our Father who art in heaven, at the beginning of something, and then someone from a different culture being scared of it. So yeah, you're right. You can use religion is a good way of creeping people out, and you can use a foreign religion if it's foreign to you, I mean, as a way of putting you in a realm you don't know what the rules are anymore. That's what I like about The Serpent and the Rainbow. It's that it's existing in a religion, like sort of Haitian voodoo, which you're kind of like, oh, what's going on here? What's this powder they keep spitting in people's faces? Snakes coming from beyond the grave. It's a bit more chaotic, and horror films thrive on throwing you into mysterious scenarios. So yeah, that's a cool way of putting it.
Yeah, because the two, I say, Serpent and the Rainbow it was on my touch point, but the other one I thought about was which is a weird cross, and is less a horror film, more of a weird supernatural thriller, but is Angel Heart.
Oh yeah,
Robert De Niro with the worst pseudonym ever. I think isn't he like Louis Cypher?
Yeah, yeah, I remember that. That's like a sort of you know, those crappy jokes that you used to
Yeah.
have, which were like, you know, this book's called, you know, Stealing by Bank Robber.
Yeah. My name's Seymour. Seymour Butts.
Yeah.
But then that's like a detective story, and that again has that, you know, I think it's in Louisiana, but it has that sort of the voodoo rituals, and so it crosses over, and it's that acceptance again of that supernatural. It's a very weird film. I actually quite enjoy it, but
It's good. Yeah, it is a good film. I remember the scene where is it Lisa Bonet and she's in bed and she's covered in chicken's blood or something. I remember that being etched into my mind when I was a kid. But you know, this point you made about the other, it just made me think that what's very interesting today as well is that the more that like Christianity and particularly evangelicalism, which you know you could describe as more fundamentalist Christians, the more they start to slip away from reflecting mainstream thought, they become the other in our society. And so more and more, and actually particularly in the novels I write, evangelical Christians become the source of the fear. And so for some people, actually, even if they're living in a Western world view that has a Christian kind of background, just hearing someone pray the Lord's Prayer is spooky in itself, because it makes you think, oh crap, it's a religious person, it's a Christian, and Christians are actually these days quite scary. Well, at least the ones you see on TV are.
Yes,
you know,
yeah.
there's a lot of us that are actually pretty normal and liberal and chilled out, but the ones that get on TV, and the ones that have got the placards at gay people's funerals saying God hates fags, which is just shocking, but those people exist and they get the airtime. And so I'm not surprised that people find that scary, and therefore they become a source for horror.
I agree, and I think that's it, isn't it? It's I say easy, is probably the wrong word, but it's almost like you're tapping into people's subconscious fears. That, you know, that thing I say, that thing that is out there, and even as from a child, I think there's in the film Kevin Smith film Dogma, there's a line in that about one of the characters in her faith, and she's, well, when I was young, my faith glass was a lot smaller, so it was easy to top up. And as I've got older, the glasses got bigger, and it's harder to fill. And you know, so she's questioning her faith.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
But the thing that sort of, especially let's say being in a white Westerner myself, is that sort of Christianity is sort of, it's just there. You know, when you're a kid, it's an easy way for people to explain that Granny's gone to heaven, or
Yes.
Fido's gone to heaven too, and so's your fish and everything else. That you just this faith structure is just a background. So the superstition and the supernatural that is adhered to it, it's just like an easy go-to. It's like, okay, well, the people know that, and it's always going to be that little nugget, whether you actually be a Christian or not, a lapsed Christian, or whatever. It's there. Like you have had. It'd be very difficult to find a white Christian. I'm just using it as a sort of a demographic that hasn't had in Britain access, or at least some exposure to, like a Christian iconography and structure.
Precisely, and for some of those people, they would have had a very negative experience. And I never went to church growing up, and never had that kind of feeling of being brainwashed into it. That in some ways it was kind of a rebellion for me to start going to church, because I was so anti it before. But some people have been brought up in very strict religious environments, and so for them it's naturally a scary thing. But there are others who, are kind of lukewarm about religion, and others still who actually might harbor a sense of worry or doubt that, that they've moved on from this idea of thinking about spirituality. And so if they're thrown into a supernatural situation, like you see in horror films, they suddenly are like, oh crap, am I on my own here, or can I get help? And this is what I find interesting about one of the symbols you see, a religious symbol you see quite a lot in horror movies, is the abandoned church building. Is like the old decrepit church buildings that are a source of great fear and spookiness and gothic sort of chills, which is great. But they're also, I think, a very potent symbol for what we're talking about, which is the presence of religion is there, but it's faded. It's kind of lost its grandeur from before. And that has got a sense of spookiness about it, but it's still there. You know, it hasn't been completely bulldozed. It's still around, but it's now the source of spookiness rather than comfort. And it's almost in a sense that, well, God was here for a while, back in the 50s, let's say, but you had your chance, but he's gone. You know, he was here, you didn't come when you could, and he's gone now, and now you're on your own to face this demonic entity or whatever it is, this monster, this vampire. And that's just a kind of, I like that. It's a kind of cool scenario to make people feel unsettled. So I'm not surprised there's a lot of abandoned churches in films, because it evokes subconscious thought in us, I think.
It does, like you say, I like that. I really like that idea, because it taps in almost into that guilt of and worry of, oh yeah, I've stepped away. So that's sort of like, you know, abandonment, let's say, of the church. In you know, is it in both ways, or is it just me walking away? I like the mention that you mentioned the 50s. And again, this is something, as I was going through all this research, it was something I read, which was about the transition and the introduction of this idea of religion and Christianity in horror films. And it said, like, you know, following like the Second World War and into the 50s, it was especially in America, it was. You know, they almost sort of say that they were the best generation ever, and so that was the nuclear family was that ideal that, you know, dad went to work, mum stayed at home, and he went to church on Sunday, and it was very sanitized. And then you get the counterculture of the 60s, and that sort of counterculture sort of stems that other, you know, sort of spirituality, but almost as another, you know, so that, we do believe there's a soul, and we do believe that, but now we believe that there's a reincarnation. Yeah. That sort of thing gets reflected in, I think, really, in sort of like in the 60s into the 70s. That Christianity element still remains, because it becomes solid, but again, it becomes the dogmatic villain. And the one I sort of think of the most is Rosemary's Baby, where you know, Rosemary is isolated and surrounded by Satanists. Like, she doesn't, you know, spoilers for a film from the 60s, but like she, you know, she is literally sort of impregnated by Satan, and she's being gaslighted throughout. And it's that isolation of the other, or this counterculture set up to sort of, you know, separate this virginal looking woman from the rest. It's such a good theme that then I think gets, you know, then you start to get into that sort of what I say is the to-ing and fro-ing of, like, you know, you said about Christian propaganda, and sort of argued that is the to-ing and fro-ing of, like, in Rosemary's Baby, there's very little, because it is Christian, it's all, obviously it's about the devil as a physical entity, but there's very little actual church, as in.
Yeah, you know, that's right. It's very different to a film like The Exorcist, where you could say that's more like Christian propaganda, whereas you're right, Rosemary's Baby, and I think this is one of the things I love about Rosemary's Baby, is that it's actually, you could read it as fairly supportive of belief or worship of the devil, and I just find that an interesting exploration to do in the 60s, because, you know, like you said, you know, after the 50s, people are kind of a bit disillusioned. They've gone through the you know, they've trusted in God, and then they've went through a horrific world war you know, ending in the 40s. And at the 50s, things start to look up, but then things go wrong again. And then in the 60s, you know, people do start turning to spirituality, like you said. But that's when we get the great kind of mainstream occult explosion, as they call it, where people are just more and more interested in witchcraft and devil worship and Satanism and those sorts of things, which I find, by the way, a completely legitimate thing to be interested in. You know, some people think, you know, it would be absolutely wrong to explore other faiths or religions, but I'm the type of guy who thinks it's important to explore and find out what you believe. But yeah, so Rosemary's Baby is a great example of, in a way, a supportive view of coming around to believe, you know what, maybe the devil's all right. and I mean, I don't want to spoil the film for you, but that in some ways that's kind of like the message, unless of course you subscribe to the idea that it's all in her head, and there's the theory that in Rosemary's Baby, the baby is stillborn, and this is her. She's gone insane.
Yeah, it's her playing it out. Which is
one
of the reasons again what the film's so great, because that theory still, does stand up. You can follow through on that as a theory. It really works.
Yeah, but sorry to interrupt you there, but I think you're right about Rosemary's Baby not having a lot of the to and fro between kind of Christianity versus Satanism or devil worship or whatever, which are, I guess, two different things. But a film that does have a lot of to and fro, and it does it in a really great way, is The Wicker Man, which of course came a decade later, and that very clearly explores the kind of, if you want to call it, the pagan explosion, or the sort of the more embracing of more earth type religions, which is understandable, by the way. That makes total sense to me why people would find those religions more interesting. I've interviewed quite a lot of Wiccans for an article I wrote once, and they were saying about they tried Christianity, but it was so male-centric and so anti-ecology, or just not interested in ecology, that they found their place in more like paganistic religions, for want of a better term. I don't know what the right term is, but these sorts of religions that you see in The Wicker Man.
Yeah.
But The Wicker Man is great because it has a lot of back and forth where Sergeant Howie, played by Edward Woodward, is just he cannot believe what's happening. He goes to the school in Summerisle, and he finds out that Christianity is being taught as a comparative religion rather than as the religion. He's like, "What are you doing? Do these kids not know about Jesus? What's going on?" And I'm sure that Christopher Lee's character says at one point, "Hey, your God had his chance, but he blew it."
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Wicker Man is one of the films on my list that I really like, because it's one of those films as well where no one is a clear, like, no one's clearly the better. Like you say, when he comes to Summerisle, like Christopher Lee is incredibly sinister throughout, wonderfully so.
Especially in the dress part.
Yeah. And so when it does reach its climax, and you think, oh my God, these pagans, these Wiccans, and that they've really taken this to a whole new level. And so you think, well, I can't support them. But then when you meet, let's say Sergeant Howie, like, he again is like so dogmatic and so stuffy that he's not, he's not like a pure, heroic character either. Because he's also, he's pointing, well, your way of life is wrong and corrupted. And there is a scene, I think, in Christopher Lee's character studying, where they have that conversation, and they do. I think he does say something on those lines, and says, "Well, he blew it, like he had his chance, because we now do this, and this, he keeps the crops growing, and we have great this, we have great that," and you sort of think, well, okay, well, it's tough to argue with that. Like you say, you followed a different path until the path leads to The Wicker Man.
Yeah, but even The Wicker Man itself, that what happens in the end is in many ways a kind of essentially Christian idea. I mean, it's a twisted version of it, but right at the heart of Christianity is this symbol of the cross, which many people think is, oh, what a nice thing to have on a tea towel, or to give to your girlfriend for Valentine's Day, perhaps an earring shaped like the cross. But of course, it's a form of execution. And at the very heart of Christianity is this idea of Jesus' death on a cross, and that sacrifice somehow opens the doorway for us to be connected with God again. And that's what they're doing on Summerisle. They're just doing it with Iwa Woo Woo, Edward Woodward, sticking him up there. And obviously the difference is he's not going willingly, whereas in Christianity Jesus is going as a kind of willing sacrifice. But it's still that same that religious idea of a sacrifice having to be made. And this, again, is something that is in a lot of horror films, that some sort of sacrifice, blood must be shed to appease an angry God. And people sadly still think that is exactly what Christianity is like, but there's growing numbers of Christians who don't view it that way, that, they see Jesus' death on a cross not as, him being punished by a super angry God who wants to lash out at someone so he picks his son, but more like a kind of demonstration of love and sacrifice, and say, no, listen, man, guys, I'm going to take this bullet for you because I love you so much, which is a bit different from, a blood-hungry God desperate to kill someone. And then Jesus steps in, right, I'll kill you instead. But yeah, so sacrifice, in The Wicker Man is, in lots of films, is quite a big horror thing.
It is, and you're right, because again, I've got it on my notes, I've got them under like old religion, that sort of old world religion is very much sort of driven on that. And again, sort of, going back to Hereditary, which had that sort of like, it forms a ritualistic religion around witchcraft. There's the other one. I don't know if you think The Blood on Satan's Claw.
Oh yeah,
another sort of folk horror films from the 70s and stuff. It's very sacrificing as as a younger generation of coming, which is totally about counterculture.
I had dinner with Linda Hayden once, just to drop names, but that's the woman from Blood and Satan's Claw, and it was so messing with my mind, because like I had such a massive crush on her when I was a kid, when I was a teenager watching that, even with her crazy eyebrows, I was like, oh my word, she's gorgeous. And then I got an opportunity to have dinner, and it was just it was so wild. But you're right, that film and so many like it just have this. And by the way, of course, sacrifice as well is a great plot device, because it just makes sense in a storytelling technique to say we have to kill someone and it has to happen at a certain time, and if it does it, that will change things. And there's a lead up to that, and there's a sort of crescendo with the sacrifice. So it's a kind of a good thing to put in a story as well as being kind of resonant.
It does, it works well, because other ones I thought of was like the film Apostle, which is the Netflix film. I say that's sort of. I really enjoyed that film, because it taps into more of like weird fiction, sort of weird fiction kind of horror, and it has that idea of like they actually see. And again, I'm not going to spoil it because it's such a good film, but they actually see the power of a supernatural being, and then want to utilize that as they form a cult around that sort of thing.
You see that same idea in things like H.P. Lovecraft's Shadow over Innsmouth, which was filmed by Stuart Gordon as Dagon, but of like a little fishing village who they worship the old ones. They worship this god called Dagon because he provides. He actually works for them, whereas the Christian god doesn't seem to work out for them. But these guys go for Dagon instead.
Yeah, and Lovecraft definitely taps into that. Apart from, let's say, the whole the Cthulhu mythos, many of his smaller stories as well that sort of like slightly tap into it do really tap into that idea of, like say, cults and religious sort of groups that, like you say, have moved away from from Christianity, and he uses that, and it's sort of like saying, they worship this being that they know exists. But it's not a god, it's actually some sort of interdimensional or sort of like time-travelling, amorphous creature.
Yes.
And so, it's that thing of like, well, they don't worship, they don't have faith, they've actually physically seen it. Like, they know these things exist, and it's driven them mad to that sort of... And I think of like, I don't know if you've seen the film The Ritual.
Yes,
again, like the
Adam Neville film.
Yeah, so, at the end of that film... which is again a great film, really sort of worth seeing. But the climax of that film, and they come across that sort of, they come across a community in the Nordic woods that has been offered the opportunity for immortality through an actual being. Like this thing, they call it a god, but it's a physical entity. So it's
yes, that's a good distinction. Yeah, you're right. That's interesting. I never thought about that before. But you're right. Like there's the idea of having a kind of a spirit, a god as spirit or whatever, and then a more incarnated version of divinity. Of course, I mean, that's what Christianity says in terms of Jesus being an incarnation of God. And the word incarnation is interesting because the original Latin word for incarnation, the word carn, is the same word we use for the word carnivore or carnosaur. It's about meat. And so the idea of the incarnation is that God comes with meat on, like in meat, as in the flesh. So we talk about God coming in the flesh as Jesus. So the idea is Jesus is like the perfect example of who God is. If you want to know what God's like, you look at Jesus, because it's God in flesh. But ironically, a lot of Christians and a lot of critics of Christianity get mixed up here because the God that is painted is just terrible, and he's nothing like Jesus' character. Jesus is kind, loving, progressive, caring. That's what God's supposed to be like. But people have this view of him being more like the angry
Old Testament
blood-hungry monster. Yeah, so it's all quite interesting. But yeah, you're right. This idea of having God in the flesh, or deity in the flesh, is a cool idea. I didn't think of that with the ritual, but you're right.
I think it sort of comes to others as well. Like, this idea of having that. It forces these people in the film to question their faith, because a lot of them do start.
Yeah,
as whether it be Judeo-Christian or whatever, but the question of like, well, how could is there a God? Actually, I'm seeing this other thing now, this entity, and I think even like to ridiculous things like Children of the Corn,
Oh, Children of the Corn. I love. I like the first 25 minutes of Children of the Corn. I think I can't remember how long it is, but I think the opening scene to Children of the Corn is amazing. The bit where all the kids turn on their family in the ice cream. And then after that happens, it cuts to the drawings, the kids' drawings, when the titles comes up with that Jonathan Elias music. And it's just flipping heck. This film is scaring the crap out of me. And then when they hit the kid, but then after that it goes a bit downhill.
It's another one of those sort of a Stephen King short story being stretched way beyond its running time. But again, it's sort of.
Sorry, I interrupted you though. Go on.
You make it is a good film. Like I say, the opening of that the story is only about 30 pages long, so it's not a big book.
It's really short.
But I like the idea of that again. Of that, they are well aware of this being, this entity. He who lives behind the rose, or
he who walks behind the rose.
Walks behind the rose. And it's so they've it's that thing of it picking the children to work through, and then in a wonderfully sort of horrible way. But again, it's that thing that this is a physical entity that they have seen.
Yeah.
So it's, again, them being able to, and they sort of overlay almost like Christian iconography in that, because say that the lead character, they've all got very religious names. I know it's supposed to be the sort of the farm belt of America. But even the way they sort of picture him, he's got the wide brim hat. He's a very sort of Western preacher kind
definitely.
of look.
Yeah, very much so. And actually, it's good you brought up Children of the Corn, because it reminds me that the poster for that had a Bible quote on it, which was I don't know if you remember, but it said something like, "A little child shall lead them." I'm sure that's on the poster, which is a quotation from Isaiah 11, which talks about the wolf dwelling with the lamb and the leopard sitting with a young goat, a calf and young lion being together. So it's all this nice idea. There's a paradise, and then it says, "And a little child shall lead them." It's supposed to point towards Jesus and all that. But in Children of the Corn, they turn it into the children are going to take over and kill us, which I just thought was wild. I loved it.
Yeah, Children of the Corn is a great example of that, where they take the iconography and use it almost as an easy gateway to sort of as an example to show people how you recognize this, and now we're going to twist it, sort of thing.
And Children of the Corn actually does that with the Bible as well itself. I mean, there's the poster. I really like the poster for Children of the Corn. It's a really cool image of the black silhouette of the hand holding the scythe and the kids in the corn. It's a really great image. But on the posters, as I recall, it has the Bible quotation from Isaiah 11 verse 6, which says, "And a little child shall lead them." And in the Bible, what comes before that is talking about the wolf is going to dwell with the lamb and the leopard with the young goat and all that. And it's basically saying things are going to be cool. You know, people are going to have peace, and we're going to love one another, and even the scary things are going to be connected with the nice things, and we're going to be okay. And then it says, and a little child shall lead them, which is supposed to point towards Jesus coming and all that. But Children of the Corn says, no, forget all the nice stuff. A little child shall lead them to stuff their dad's hand into a meat grinder in the first 5 minutes of the film. And so, and horror films do this. They take kind of sometimes scripture, the idea of the Bible, and will twist it, like you said, into new ways. The Omen being a good example in that. Even the writer of The Omen, I think it was David Selznick. He in extras, in DVD extras for The Omen, he was going on and on about like this is a biblical film. This is steeped in the Bible. And then he would use examples of like Mrs. Baylock, played by Billy Whitelaw, the nanny who comes to look after Damien. It's like Mr. Baylock is actually a name for, he said, is a name for the devil's handmaidens that are talked about in the Bible. And it's like, there are no things like that in the Bible. What are you talking about? He's making that up. Yeah. But it's a great way of bringing this religious idea into it. I think actually Pulp Fiction, you know, the famous line from Ezekiel in Pulp Fiction where Samuel L. Jackson is talking about with extreme vengeance and all this stuff. But that is also a made-up quotation as far as I know. I'd have to double-check that, but I don't think it's straight from the Bible. But it doesn't matter because people hear it and go, whoa, this has some sort of weight.
It sounds like it's got authority and I know what you mean, and I think the Omen's an interesting one. In fact, I think it's sort of. I almost think of like there's a positive Christian sandwich in a trilogy. There, you get sort of like Rosemary's Baby, which has that sort of like you say it can be read as a positive interpretation of Satan worship with a downbeat ending. And then you know it's followed sort of 4 years later by The Exorcist in '73, and that's got it's got a relatively downbeat ending, but Christianity wins. You know, it shows the sort of the positivity of faith and the strength that these people, that you know, the two priests find in their faith in combating the evil, which is really well done. I think it's an excellent film. And then you actually sort of they flip it again and go, well, in this one actually. You know, again, sort of, it's going to have a downbeat ending, and evil will technically win.
In which one? Sorry, the
Omen. Sorry, so then you get the Omen in sort of '78, and it's that sort of thing of.
Oh, sorry, I see what you mean. Yeah, that's right. And then, but then the Omen trilogy, the final conflict with Sam Neill, that actually commits a crime in terms of movies and religion and Christianity and horror, because. What audiences are happy for religion to be used as a kind of a trope for spookiness and scariness and everything. But what audiences don't tend to like is when God blatantly saves the day. And like The Exorcist, for example, even though you could read that as kind of good wins out, it's not specifically God turning up as an angel and saving Reagan. It's actually the self-sacrifice of Father Karras who does it, and so we can connect with that on a human level. You know, he sacrificed himself. That's good. But then you get the Omen 3, the final conflict, when you know Jesus the Nazarene turns up and actually sort of sorts everything out. And so many horror film people I know, including myself, just feel like. Really? You know, like that was, especially after, I think The Final Conflict's actually a pretty underrated horror movie. There's a lot of cool stuff leading up to that, but the end, even me as a kind of fully paid up kind of spiritual type who does pray to Jesus and all that stuff, even I was sitting there going, oh really? The statue of Jesus saves everything here? Yeah, and that goes back to that sort of thing I said before. Sort of like sometimes it becomes a bit of an easy get out. Like they will literally just say, in this case, you know, like you say, God turns up and saves the day, or Jesus, or whatever, and it becomes that thing of like the Deus Ex Machina. Oh, we've sort of we've painted ourselves into a bit of a corner. Here's how we're going to get out of it. People don't like that.
No, and it does because it feels easy, and that's why I think The Exorcist stands up so well. Because there is no Deus Ex Machina. It is literally the priest's faith
Yeah.
It's their faith that saves the day. And it's not about them saying, yes, God is real or whatever. You sort of it's implicit because there's demons in it.
Yeah.
But actually, beyond that, it's their faith and their strength that saves them. Oh, that's why it's such a fantastic film. It's easily one of my favourite horror films.
Yeah, I love it, but many people think it's crap, and I've spoken to Satanist friends who see it as a complete slice of propaganda and just a ridiculous film because it's so kind of blatant.
Not being hugely religious myself, I never saw it as sort of religious propaganda, and
Right.
I understand that argument. I can see where people come from for it, but it's only when people have sort of said it to me that I've gone, okay, I can see your point. But for me, I've always seen it as a human story.
Yeah.
Especially for Father, I forgot his name now.
Karras.
Yeah. You know, he's wrestling with guilt with regards to his mother and his faith.
Yeah, and doubt
and
too.
Everything. Yeah. And so it's not about, again, it's not some Deus Ex Machina where I believe in God so I can save her. It's about a human struggle.
Yeah, and I think that does resonate with audiences, and you this aspect of kind of its personal faith, which is really what connects. And this is what's interesting, I think, when you can chart like the decline in Christian influence, if you will, or in interest in Christianity in society, alongside the changing role of the cross in vampire movies. Because, like there was a time when you might watch a Hammer film and really technically all you had to do was whip out the cross and it would terrify and scare Dracula. He would run away. And you didn't particularly have to do anything. All the power was in the actual object itself. That in itself is what mattered. But then you fast forward to, let's say, the 70s, the late 70s, get a great adaptation of Salem's Lot by Stephen King, the TV version by Toby Hooper. I absolutely adore the TV version of Salem's Lot from, I think it's 79, David Soul. But in that, there's an interesting moment when Mr. Barlow, this creepy, bald, rat-toothed, blue-skinned monster, comes into the room where the boy is, can't remember his name, and the kid in the film anyway, and he pulls a cross out. The kid pulls a cross out to protect himself at that point. This is before he kills his parents. And then Mr. Barlow just grabs this cross and throws it to the side. And it's because the boy doesn't have faith in it. Oh, no, it's the priest. It's the priest who holds it. And he doesn't have faith in it. And then this happens in Fright Night as well.
Yes, I was going to say that's what I was going to go to. Yeah.
Yeah, he whips out the cross, and Charlie Dandridge, or whatever he's called, Jerry Dandridge, sorry, is saying to Charlie, "You got to have faith. You got to have faith. It doesn't matter without your faith." Now, in the 50s, in the Hammer films, faith was irrelevant because the power was in the object. 70s and 80s, the power is in the faith. It's in the individual. Then you cross into, say, the 90s and into the 2000s, and then the cross actually starts becoming completely ineffectual with vampires. In fact, there's some... I can't remember one of the films. It might have been the adaptation of Interview with a Vampire, the Neil Jordan version, where Louis or one of the other vampires is saying, "Oh, I'm actually quite fond of crosses. I quite like them." And it just becomes a thing they're into. And then Twilight and all that stuff, it's just absolutely irrelevant. It doesn't feature.
Yeah. It's an interesting part of it that I say it's that. You're right,
Yeah.
Into the 90s. I mean, and then the flip of that again is if you watch From Dusk Till Dawn.
Oh yes, yeah.
And Harvey Keitel in that, he has two shotguns and forms them into a cross, and it sort of works. But he's a lax.
Yeah.
Again, going back to that idea of faith and that being the thing that works. That the idea of the cross being a weapon, and holy water as well. The other one, that sort of thing in the other thing in the canon. You talk about vampires, but one of the ones that I always thought was odd, that it went this way, is Freddy Krueger.
Yeah.
So in Nightmare on Elm Street 3, which is I think probably the best one of the series, it has the climax of the film is sort of a dual climax. Like there's a whole climax in the dream areas. All those kids that being looked after in the institution are trying to combat Freddy, and then the other side is they're told by a ghost nun, which just happens turns out to be Freddy's mum. That you need to find his remains and bury them in consecrated ground.
Oh yeah, crikey!
So they have to pull his remains out the back of a Cadillac in the thing, and then they use holy water and a cross, and that's actually what defeats him in the end.
Ah, yeah, crikey! I'd forgotten about that. Yeah, there's a prayer cross. They put holy water on him. Blimey.
Yeah, and so there's that again that you can defeat ultimate evil with with ultimate light, and
that's 87. I think that 1987 that came out. So that's pretty late. But yeah, again, still I say peddling Christianity. I mean, for me, Christianity is meaningful, so it's sharing the power of Christianity, but it's still in many people's eyes peddling this idea that the answer is in Christianity itself. That's interesting. I'd forgotten about that.
Because that felt a little bit like they'd painted themselves into a corner, and they obviously introduced Amanda Kruger, his mother, as being a nun. So it sort of makes sense. I mean, that was again introduced by Wes Craven. That was in his original script.
And she was she raped by the inmates or something?
That's right. Yeah, he's the bastard son of 1,000 maniacs. And
that's it. Oh, that's a brilliant line.
It is. Yeah.
Crikey, I'd forgotten that line.
Which is probably one of the most horrific scenes in that film, is when you see that she gets locked in over a holiday break, and it's and you actually see like a Robert Englund, in no makeup but dressed in rags, sort of lurking in the back of this crowd of lunatics, all trapped in this pit. It's such
that's a good film, isn't it, Craigie? I haven't seen it in ages. You forget, but that was a solid entry. That was.
But we talked about Stephen King before, and it's just popped into my head actually about that. But you say about the sort of the late 70s and King with Children of the Corn, and that idea of evangelical. And I suppose I can't really talk about horror and religion without talking about Carrie's mum.
Oh, crikey, yeah.
Almost
and dirty pillows.
That's right, yeah. But that's that sort of thing of it's almost to like parody levels, but played.
Yeah.
But again, it uses that thing of sort of evangelical and sort of again, some of that makes no sense. And Carrie actually points out at the end of the film, you're babbling, this isn't from the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a completely kind of twisted version of Christianity, because it's not reflecting Jesus as being this kind-hearted, caring guy in that. And this is what's good about it, of course. This is what makes it enjoyable, because it's so scary. But one of the scariest moments I found in Carrie was her sitting in her prayer closet and having. You think it's Jesus on the cross, but I actually think it's one of the saints who's sort of shot with arrows. I can't remember which saint, but at the time I just assumed it was Jesus. And it's like this little model, and he's got these really bright eyes, like he's got a little bulb inside his head, and I'm like, this is scaring the crap out of me. This is touching me in a kind of profound way, probably because I've got this religious upbringing somewhere. Well. I live in a society that's had religion, and I've turned away from that completely when I was a teenager, and it's spooking me out, the idea of religion coming back in an aggressive way or in an evil way. And of course, at the end of that film, she is the mum experiences a very religious ending, if you want to put it that way. It's great. Stephen King, of course, he bounces around this idea of the strict evangelical in other parts of his work. I mean, one of the most noticeable recently, in the last 10 years, I should say, is in The Mist, where he has that, I can't remember her name, is Carmody? I can't remember her name, but...
Yes, Mrs. Carmody, yeah.
Yeah, and she's this very kind of stereotypical, scary Christian, and she is scary, and she sees all of this, the monsters coming as a sort of sign of divine judgment.
And again, though, you say about how quickly. I mean, it's less so in the story, but in the film, the film adaptation, how quickly that turns to human sacrifice.
Yeah, very good point. Yes.
You know, again, like she sees these physical beings, and she's like, okay, this is judgment cast on the world. We have to, placate them with some sort of sacrifice, and
which is scary. But of course, I do think that's what we do, and I think it's very easy for the non-religious person to sit there and go, "Oh, that's the type of attitude that religious people have." But us people who aren't religious or who are atheists, we don't think that way. But we are constantly, and this is just depressing, but we are constantly in the business of public sacrificing. The second someone says something on Twitter that is, slightly not right, just people delight in the public shaming and sacrifice of individuals because it seems to be a way of getting rid of our own our own guilt, or like how many people make, let's say, politically incorrect, inappropriate jokes in private, and then someone publicly does that, and then they're all, oh my god, I couldn't believe that person said that, what a scumbag, he should be banned from Twitter, he should be fired. And it's almost like this public lynching. This idea of sacrifice through anger is sadly part of the human condition. But
I agree, and I think that sort of comes through, unfortunately every day, and people take sides, and this idea of, as you said about, again, like, Monsanto, this there seems to be like an introduction of rigidity. You sort of, well, I'm part of this clan, and I'm part of this clan, and I'm part of this clan. So it's like, and it's weird that you see people talk about liberal acceptance. Okay, well, I don't really care. I'm colourblind, and I don't care about your gender or your sexuality or your if you liked the end of Game of Thrones or not. Like, I don't care. That's your world. But it's still, however, like you say, that person will then step out of line, and I'm not going to take sides in anything that's ever happened, just in case. But you're right, like someone will say something or do something, and all of a sudden, my clan, we can't accept that. I don't support that. That's completely against the LGBT community. That's completely against the a fundamentalist Christian view, or
or whatever whatever group you want to put in there.
It's almost like it's that idea of unifying against a single enemy. And again, it creates that other, doesn't it? That sort of idea.
Yeah, completely. This is one of the reasons why I did become a Christian and wanted to be into the Jesus stuff, because what I've liked about him was that it was all about loving everyone, including your enemy. And it was about, even when they're nailing you to a cross, to love people and to look for forgiveness and connection. And that's what I like about Christianity at its purest form. It's supposed to be about having unity with one another, but not uniformity. That's very different. And unfortunately, so many people, they think unity is uniformity. So everyone has to be Christian. Everyone has to be this, that, and the other. And it's like, actually, we human beings, let's kind of journey together, to use a jargony term. Anyway, sorry, we're going off on one there.
No, but it's true. I mean, it's funny that someone said to me the other day, we were talking about this exact thing, and someone just said, "It's we need Ozymandias in Watchmen probably wasn't too far off then. To prevent all these small groups of unity, you need a bigger enemy. That's what you need, because again, it's just human nature to sort of, it's easier to fear and be repelled by something than it is to just love and accept things as they are.
Completely, yeah. And of course, like, loving enemies doesn't mean, throwing away justice, or, if someone burns my house down and kills my family. It's not the Christian Jesus thing to do, to like high five that guy and go bowling with him. Go, hey, it's fine. There has to be law and order and justice and stuff. But the idea of vengeance and hate becoming the default position for those who do things we don't like is just not a healthy way of having a society. But sadly, more and more these days, people are getting kind of isolated in their groups.
Yes.
And so it's easy to define one another by your enemy, which is a bit
And
sad.
that's it. And I do think and horror definitely taps into that. You know, that idea of fear and unity. I mean, we go back to The Apostle on Netflix. That's very much what that film is about. It's people escaping to an island because of whatever, and then forming this little community, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, you're different, and if you're different, then you're against the community, and if you're against the community, then you're an enemy, and that mentality is really dangerous.
Yeah, it makes me think of The Village as well.
Yes.
Which has a similar kind of like, let's define ourselves based on our enemies. We're gonna have enemies, obviously, and obviously horror has to have an enemy. Like
that's sort of the point.
You know, it kind of makes sense. Even if the enemy is ourselves, there has to be something that's upsetting us for horror to make sense. But that's what I like about horror. It kind of explores these things, but in a way that doesn't have to. Like I can watch a horror movie in which there is an enemy, a horrible person in it, but I can almost get out of my system that stuff and delight when the baddie's head is chopped off at the end and go, yes, it's okay. And I can get that out of my system and then turn to the person next to me who's completely different from me and show them love. Because there is we do have that sense of justice in us, and that's normal and that's quite right. We should, it shouldn't be just anyone could do whatever they like. You shouldn't be able to come and kill my family. That's not right.
No.
But I do think the answer is to look for forgiveness for one another. But obviously horror's not going to go into too much depth about that.
No, and I think
is all right.
This idea of I'm trying to think of the way to put it, actually, almost that thing of like unity and that sort of thing, and when they do take it to the extreme, is that they almost provide like an elite. And again, I think sort of the Exorcist sort of touches on this, because you get sort of Father Merrin in particular, the experienced exorcist, and more so I think in especially with like the Conjuring series, this idea of like, well, we've got specialist knowledge of the supernatural. So you get like the Warrens, or if you've seen The Rite with Anthony Hopkins, which is another one. But one of the ones that I found really bizarre, because it's almost like an origin story, and I don't know if we're going to do a series, but is a film called Deliver Us from Evil.
The Scott Derrickson film.
Yeah, with Eric Banner in. So it's not a bad film. It's actually quite an enjoyable film.
That's the one with the zoo. There's a scene at a zoo, isn't there?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember that. That's quite cool, that bit.
And it finally has an exorcism in a prison cell at the end. And it's really, the film's actually really good. And I think Scott Derrickson is a great horror director. Yeah,
and also a committed Christian. Like he's. It's interesting about him. He also did The Exorcism of Emily Rose, but he's a guy who is quite open about his Christianity, but is also happy to be a Christian who can criticize the more fundamentalist flavors of Christianity.
Well, the Exorcism of Emily Rose is interesting, because that's actually, although they've changed the names and stuff, is actually, if I'm right, is based on the case of a German girl whose name escapes me completely.
Anneliese Michel, yeah.
That's it, Anneliese, who died as a result of an exorcism.
Yeah, that's horrific, yeah.
And then there's obviously that question of, was she actually possessed, or was it, did she really die of malnutrition and abuse because of the treatment she got? And so to confront
I think it's the latter, if you're interested. But
yeah. But it's that thing of like, it's confronting that behaviour, isn't it? And again, and for, like you say, for Scott Derrickson as a Christian to confront that and make that film and say, actually, we need to talk about this. And he does the same in Deliver Us from Evil, because Deliver Us from Evil it's a cracking, modern horror film. It's got some good jump scares in, and Eric Banner's pretty good in it. But it wasn't until I sort of, you read about these things when it first came out, and it's like, oh no, this is based on a real bloke.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it? I mean, obviously, his claims, he claimed to have, was he a policeman, wasn't he?
He was. He left the police force, or he retired, and he says, I take on, he's still alive. I mean, he's written a number of books in which he recounts incidents and encounters and all these kind of things with all kinds of supernatural things that he says, New York is riddled with, and you think, well, maybe they do need the Ghostbusters.
I mean, the possession thing is interesting. I mean, ironically, I'm currently just finishing the fourth novel, like I mentioned before, which comes out next year in shops. But it's called Possessed, and it specifically explores demonic possession. And one of the things the book tries to explore is how often mental illness can be misdiagnosed as possession, and it's possible for the Eric Bana's character, the real life guy. Who knows? Maybe he did encounter real life supernatural things, but maybe he's just meeting people with Tourette's syndrome or alien hand syndrome or temporal lobe epilepsy or something, and he's just sort of going, oh well, they're getting freaked out because of the cross, so maybe they're possessed. So it's a very dangerous world, the possession world. But more and more kind of, you're in about like religions having potentially saying we have the right, R-I-T-E. We have the forbidden knowledge. But now with like the internet, we have this kind of democratization of knowledge where people, anyone can kind of become an expert in things. And so therefore you're getting a big kind of like an indie scene of exorcists. You don't just have to go to the Vatican. You can just find someone online. I know some people who've, they got a qualification as a demonologist just from a certificate online. It doesn't particularly mean a great deal, but people will believe it.
But it is interesting, isn't it? That's it. That thing. Like I say, we've been opened up to this ability now. This. I always say that with the internet, every piece of worldly knowledge is now at my fingertips. If I wanted it, I could find it. Everything like that, and it gives you this access. And like I say, people by having, but that believe that access equals understanding.
Well, exactly, and it doesn't. And sometimes access can equal ignorance because you think you get the answer straight away, and you haven't. You don't know for certain if the source you've got is legit, or you don't spend time comparing sources. I found that when I wrote my book, The Frighteners, that I would be, let's say I wrote a chapter on murderabilia, which is the industry where people buy, souvenirs based on serial killers. Like I had a lock of Charles Manson's hair in my hand, for example. You can buy it for £40 a strand. And I was writing the chapter about that and why people are drawn to killers. But even in that, I've lost my train of thought now. Crap.
It was about not having access to information.
Sorry, that was it. Yeah. Sorry, back on track. And so when I was researching that, for example, I'd say, okay, I'm going to write a little bit about this serial killer, for example. How many victims did he have? This Russian serial killer? 42. Okay, and then I'll check another newspaper and say, oh no, it was 44. And then I'll check another newspaper. These are all national newspapers, and it's 40. And you're like, what the heck is the answer? Sometimes having the knowledge at your fingertips is just saying, no, you have certain examples, you have opinions at your fingertips.
Yes, and I think that's
you have to dig.
Yeah, and I think that's to sort of say that, to sort of round this out, really, sort of like in the horror thing. I think sometimes that's how horror can act. We've said that it's a great way of exploring both a person's spirituality and beliefs and the good and the bad of sort of whether it be as a protector or as a dogmatic villain.
Yeah.
But again, like you say, people sometimes, and this is just unfortunate, they watch a film and go, well, that's clearly what it is in real life.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's sort of, and again, one of the things I will be getting to later in maybe this year, maybe next, is the satanic panic.
Oh, that's a fascinating topic.
Yeah, and that's very much that sort of thing of unfortunately, there's some sort of do-gooder who isn't informed or isn't as open to things, does go, that heavy metal music or that Dungeons and Dragon game or that film, that's all evil. And He-Man
was even seen as being a portal to demonic activity. I mean, it's just crazy. It's crazy. But mind you, I mean, I've had experiences where I've done shows, like I've been interviewed, let's say on a Christian radio show. They're not all like this, by the way, but this woman who was the presenter, I found out later that she'd emailed around all of her Christian friends to make sure that they would pray for her when I turned up at the studio, because she assumed that I was somehow possessed or that I had some sort of demon with me because I like horror movies and I write scary novels. and I write for the Fortean Times, which explores spooky things, and all of this evidence on a CV thing she got from me, from the press people, were like, oh crap, this guy's carrying the devil. I'm like, no, I'm not.
Yeah, you're the great corruptor, Peter. That's what
the great corruptor. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But you're right though. So the Satanic Panic would be an excellent topic for you to explore, because particularly with pop culture, because there's so much in that.
Yeah, and I do think, like you say, to round this out, as we've said, is I think religion and horror is when done well, is a great exploration, not just of as I'd like to say, sort of Christian or religious lore, but also around questions of people's faith. It can be a human story. It can question spirituality, and I think it can be done incredibly well. And I think it should be done. I think it's incredibly important that this conversation and discussion happens. And sometimes I think I'll finish on one note just to give an example of why I think it's important is the ridiculousness of the other end. So there was a film called Silent Night, Deadly Night.
Oh yeah.
And the film was pulled. It was an absolute flop in America because it was pulled from cinemas because the Christian Mothers of America petitioned it and protested it across the country, across America, saying that it was corrupting the vision of Santa and. And when they actually did a poll, so a newspaper actually went out and did a poll and then asked all these people. So you saw the film, then you understand what it's doing. Not one of the people they asked had seen the film. Yeah, exactly. And it was that assumption of it's horror, so it must be must be doing what we think it is. And so I think we do have to engage, as you said, with these things to sort of challenge us and to ask these questions.
And also, like, religion and also, let's say, Santa Claus deserves to be critiqued. Like, the idea of Santa Claus is a kind of messed up idea, of this, this creepy old guy in a beard who's going to come and reward us for being good and punish us for being bad. I mean, that comes up in some stories, but yeah, I mean, that's worth critiquing. So yeah, well, that's a good point.
Brilliant. Well, Peter, I'm really glad you came on the show. It's been fantastic.
Oh, me too. I've really enjoyed it.
And I think when I do the Satanic Panic, I think I may look for you for a comment.
Sure.
And we'll see what happens. But
sounds good.
Before we run out, so where can people find you, and what should they be looking for?
Okay, well, I'll be lurking in their bathrooms and look for my shoes under the cupboard. No. You can find me on peterlaws.co.uk. You can find me on Twitter at RevPeterLaws and Instagram at RevPeterLaws. I've got a YouTube channel. Just look for Peter Laws or The Flicks the Church Forgot, and you'll find me on all the kind of the social media areas. Did I say Facebook? Peter Laws. Mm-hmm. But also, my books are out in shops, the hardback, ebook, audiobooks, all the usual jazz, paperbacks. And better say what they are. The non-fiction book is called The Frighteners, Why We Love Monsters, Ghosts, Death and Gore. That's me traveling through Transylvania and Rome and Britain, trying to understand why people have a morbid streak and defending it. And the novels that I write, the first one's called Purged, second's called Unleashed, third one's called Severed, and the fourth one that comes out next year is called Possessed, which is all about demonic possession. Woo!
Excellent. I'll say, and I will say, not to blow smoke, but I really enjoyed The Frighteners and Purged. I read, flew through it. Excellent.
Oh, wonderful. I'm so glad. Thank you.
So I highly recommend that you go and seek those out.
Awesome.
But thank you.
All right. No, thank you.
So, enjoy the rest of your evening.
And you too. Thanks, Scott. Bye-bye.
You too, mate. Cheers. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. My conversation with Peter Laws about religious iconography in horror films. Now, I'm really impressed with that. Now, I'm really pleased with that conversation. I think it went really well. I think we gave some fantastic points. We covered some fantastic stuff. And I think it's a topic that could really be revisited sometime in the future. So we'll have to see how we do with that. But in the meantime, if you want to get in contact with me and talk about religious iconography in horror or anything like that, any of the topics I've gone before, or suggest any of the topics, someone's recently stepped forward and suggested I should be covering classic Doctor Who, and that will be on the future schedule. Don't you worry, we will be talking Doctor Who at some point in the future. Talk about anything, please get in contact on email at 20thcenturygeek@gmail.com. I can also be reached through the website, that's 20thcenturygeek.com. Go check it out. There's the blog on there, Pop Culture Pulse, a load of other stuff on there, as well as all the episodes, and you can contact me directly through that. That's 20thcenturygeek.com. And of course, if you want to contact me through the social medias, I'm available on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. Just look for 20th Century Geek. And I'm there. Please reach out, give some suggestions, come say hello. Always love to interact with anybody who's ever listened to the show. And if you want to show your support for the show, and you want to tell people about how good we are, and about what the good work that we're doing, please go on, put a 5-star review on any of the podcast catchers from where you're listening to this. Really appreciate it. It raises our profile, spreads the word, gets more people listening. If you want to help us in other ways, we have got a Patreon page. Go and check that out. That's Patreon, 20th Century Geek. And we do 2 extra podcasts on there. Once a month, I ask the question, is it really that bad? When I take a look at a film that has a less than stellar reputation. And in the other podcast, I sit down with my non-nerdy wife, Alex, and we watch something that it's probably the first time she stepped into it. We've covered things like Batman 66, we've done Clerks, we've done Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So really trying to get her into that. Sometimes it lands better than other times, but it's always worth having a listen. The other thing is, of course, if you want to come check us out, we have an Amazon wish list. Books on there for all kinds of things. Help with the research that we do for the show. And we do love second-hand books in 20th Century Towers. So always welcome for those. In the meantime, I would say thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate it. And I'll catch you again next time.